The trauma bay went silent the moment Dr. Harlan Westbrook pointed at her and said, "Get her out of my OR. I don't need a nurse making decisions in my house." 30 seconds later, the man on the table flatlined. Callie Reeves didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She stepped forward, called the rhythm, ran the code, and brought him back while Westbrook stood against the wall with his arms crossed and his face going red. Nobody clapped. Nobody said a word. They just watched her strip off her gloves, log the intervention in the chart, and walk back to the supply room like she hadn't just saved a man's life in front of 12 witnesses. What none of them knew, what nobody in Halcyon General Hospital knew, was that the quiet white trauma nurse with the cropped dark hair and the slightly too still eyes had once answered to a call sign that made senior officers go quiet in briefing rooms. And somewhere in this hospital, in the next 6 hours, someone was coming to make sure she never answered to anything again. If this story already has you hooked, follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. Halcyon, Ohio wasn't the kind of city that made national news. It sat in the flat center of the state like something the interstate had forgotten. 2 grain elevators on the east side, a decommissioned rail yard to the west, and a regional medical center that had been built to serve 60,000 people and now served twice that because the nearest level 1 trauma facility was 45 minutes south on a good day. Halcyon General Hospital wasn't famous for anything. It had a decent cardiac unit, an understaffed emergency department, and the sort of institutional beige hallways that made everyone inside them look vaguely unwell. Callie Reeves had worked Trauma Bay 2 for 3 years. She had chosen Halcyon specifically because nobody came here looking for anyone. It was the kind of place you disappeared into rather than out of. The rent was low, the shifts were brutal, and nobody asked where you'd been before. The other nurses assumed she'd come from some burned-out residency program in Columbus or Cincinnati. The charge nurse, a broad-shouldered woman named Dottie Marsh, had hired her on the spot after watching her manage a 3-patient hemorrhagic trauma in the interview week without raising her voice once. Dottie knew good hands when she saw them. She didn't ask why a nurse with Callie's instincts had ended up here. Callie had filled out the paperwork under her legal name, the name that existed in the civilian record, the social security number that had been clean for 4 years. The nursing license issued 18 months after she'd walked into a county clerk's office in southern Indiana and started building herself a history that could withstand a routine background check. She had 2 references who would confirm her previous employment at a small urgent care clinic that had since closed. She had transcripts from a nursing program at a community college whose records had survived the institutional shuffle after a merger. Everything checked out because the people who had built her new identity were very good at their jobs, and because the people who might have gone looking for her believed she was dead. She had been fine with that. For 4 years, Callie Reeves had been fine with a lot of things. The morning of the incident started with a 14-year-old with a ruptured spleen and a 32-year-old cardiac arrest and a woman in Bay 4 who had taken 3 of her husband's blood pressure pills on purpose and wasn't talking to anyone. Callie rotated between all 3 with the focused quiet of someone who had learned long ago that panic was just adrenaline wearing the wrong coat. By 7:30, she had stabilized the teenager, handed the cardiac patient off to the ICU team with a full verbal report, and sat with the woman in Bay 4 long enough for the woman to cry once and then ask for water. Small victories. The kind that didn't make it into performance reviews but kept people breathing. Dr. Harlan Westbrook arrived at 8:15. He was the kind of physician who filled a room with the noise of his own importance. Not loud exactly, but weighted, the way certain men move through spaces as though the floor had been laid specifically for their benefit. He was 53, silver at the temples, and the chair of emergency medicine at Halcyon General, which meant that in the 8-bed trauma department, his opinion was institutional fact. Callie had worked around him for 3 years and had learned exactly how much space to give him. Not enough, as it turned out, on that particular morning. The VIP patient arrived at 8:22. She didn't know he was a VIP until the administrator, a thin man named Gregor Fitch, who always looked like he'd just received mildly bad news, appeared at the department entrance with 2 men in suits and the specific expression of someone performing competence rather than possessing it. The patient was a heavy-set man in his late 60s, unconscious, wheeled in from a black SUV that had pulled to the ambulance bay with the kind of deliberate haste that suggested the people moving him had rehearsed this. "Cardiac event," one of the suits said to Westbrook. "He's a federal contractor. Mr. Fitch has the authorization forms." Westbrook moved to the head of the gurney with the authority of someone who hadn't been asked. "Bay 1, he said to the room at large. "Get me Margolis from cardiology, and someone get the nurses coordinated." That last word landed with particular emphasis, the kind that meant out of my way. Callie was already at the monitor. She'd seen the rhythm the moment they'd wheeled him in. Irregular, degraded, the P-wave almost gone. She called it before she'd made the conscious decision to speak. "He's in third-degree AV block. He needs pacing, not cardiology consult time." Westbrook looked at her. Just looked. The way someone looks at a car alarm. "I didn't ask for your read, Reeves. His rate is 38. He's going to lose perfusion in—" "I said I didn't ask." He turned back to the monitor, studied it for 4 seconds with the expression of someone arriving at a conclusion they'd already reached. "Get me the cardiology team and prep for—" The patient's pressure dropped. The monitor screamed it. Callie had the external pacing pads on him before Westbrook finished the sentence, had the parameters dialed in by instinct and muscle memory, and called the rate at 60 with the kind of mechanical certainty that didn't leave room for committee discussion. The rhythm responded. Slowly, then steadily. The line found its shape. The room was quiet. Westbrook turned to her with the expression of a man choosing between embarrassment and rage. He chose rage because it was more comfortable in front of an audience. "You do not initiate interventions on my patients without my order. That is not how this department runs." Callie stripped the gloves. "He's stable. 60 beats. Adequate perfusion. I'd recommend you step back from this bay." He said it with the flat finality of someone reading from a script they'd used before. "Mr. Fitch, I want this nurse reassigned off this case." Fitch, to his minor credit, looked uncertain. "Dr. Westbrook, the patient is—" "Stable, yes, because of a nursing intervention performed without authorization in front of federal personnel. Do you understand the liability implications of that?" Westbrook moved to Fitch's shoulder and lowered his voice just enough to be theatrical about it. "Reassign her. This is not a discussion." Callie met Dottie's eyes across the bay. Dottie gave her a single small shake of her head. Not disagreement, just don't. Callie set the used gloves on the tray and walked to the nursing station. She sat down, pulled up the chart, and documented every intervention with timestamps and clinical rationale in the neat, specific language of someone who understood exactly what a legal record needed to look like. She filed it completely before Westbrook had finished his conversation with Fitch. Then she went back to Bay 4 and sat with the woman who still hadn't talked to her husband. Awesome. The reassignment came formally at 10 o'clock, delivered by Fitch himself with the apologetic manner of a man who knew the decision was wrong and had chosen his career over saying so. "We're going to have you cover the East Wing triage rotation for the remainder of your shift," he said, "just for today. While the VIP case is—" "I understand," Callie said. Fitch seemed prepared for more pushback. He blinked. "The department appreciates your—" "I said I understand." He left quickly. Triage rotation in the East Wing meant minor lacerations and flu symptoms and the occasional broken wrist from a fall. It meant being as far from the trauma bays as you could get without leaving the building. It was where they put nurses they wanted to sideline without the paperwork of a formal reprimand. Callie had seen it done to 3 other people in her time here. She'd never expected it would happen to her, which was its own kind of naivety she could have diagnosed in herself if she'd been paying attention. She worked the East Wing without complaint, sutured a cut above a 7-year-old's eyebrow while making him laugh, splinted a teenager's wrist, took vitals on a retired schoolteacher who had driven herself to the hospital with chest tightness that turned out to be musculoskeletal but had scared her enough that she'd told her neighbor where she was going, just in case. Callie sat with her longer than was strictly necessary because the woman's name was Ruth, and she reminded her of no one specifically, but of a category of person, cautious, self-sufficient, quietly brave, that Callie had always respected. By noon, she had been working 11 hours and hadn't eaten. She was in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold when Dottie appeared in the doorway. "There's something happening in the main lobby," Dottie said. Her voice was the specific neutral of someone actively trying to sound casual. "Military. A lot of it." Callie set the coffee down. "How much is a lot?" 6 vehicles. One of them's a convoy truck. Men with sidearms, but not local, not county, not federal marshals. Different uniforms. And there's a man in full dress coming through the front entrance right now. The kind of dress you don't wear for a hospital visit unless someone told you to. Callie was quiet for 3 seconds. "Which entrance?" "Main, but Fitch is already steering them toward the executive wing. I think whoever this is, they're here about the VIP in Bay 1. Dottie paused. "I thought you should know." Callie didn't answer. She stood, dropped the coffee cup in the sink, and said, "Thanks, Dot." She went back to the East Wing. She told herself that was the right call for 4 minutes before she walked to the window that overlooked the main lobby entrance. She saw him from 100 feet away, and her body did something her mind hadn't authorized. Not recognition, exactly. More like the animal response to a threat category. The way certain sounds made you turn before you'd identified them as sounds. She stood at the window and watched the man in dress uniform cross the lobby with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned to walk like authority rather than perform it. He was in his late 60s, wide through the chest, a row of decorations on his left breast that started with things most officers never saw and ended with things most officers didn't survive to receive. Rear Admiral Marcus Dole. She knew his face the way you know a thing that was burned in rather than learned. She hadn't seen him in 4 years. She hadn't expected to see him again. More importantly, he was here, in Halcyon, at this hospital, which meant someone had moved him here for a reason. And if someone had moved him here for a reason, there were other people who knew where he was. And if those people had interests that ran counter to his federal testimony, she pulled back from the window before he could scan the lobby. Her pulse was elevated. She noticed it the way she noticed clinical data, factually, without drama. She breathed through it. He doesn't know you're here, she told herself. He thinks you're dead. Everyone thinks you're dead. Walk away. She went back to Bay 3 in the East Wing and started reviewing the afternoon intake chart. She got through about 40 seconds of it before the overhead page activated. Nursing staff to Bay 1, code blue, Bay 1. Then, a second page immediately following. Security to the main lobby, security to the main lobby. Then the sound, muffled, distant, but unmistakable if you knew what you were listening for, of something falling hard. Callie was already moving. Uptet. She came through the corridor at a pace that looked like purpose rather than urgency. Another thing you learned when urgency got people killed, and pushed through the bay doors to find 3 nurses trying to manage a scene that had already broken down. The VIP patient in Bay 1 was seizing. Not a natural deterioration. The rhythm on the monitor showed something different from the AV block she'd managed that morning. The pattern had a pharmaceutical signature, the kind of chaotic electrical storm that came from something introduced rather than generated. Callie read it in 4 seconds and felt the certainty settle into her chest like a weight finding its level. Someone had gotten to him. Westbrook was at the bedside, issuing orders in the controlled voice of a man who was afraid, and the nurses were executing them with the specific anxiety of people whose best effort wasn't going to be enough. Callie moved to the medication cart, cross-checked the IV line, found the secondary port. Something had been introduced through the secondary port within the last hour. She turned to the nearest nurse, a young man named Trey, who was 2 years in and good under pressure. "Get me the medication log for this bay going back to noon. Everything. Pull the physical record." "I'm not. Dr. Westbrook hasn't." "Trey." She looked at him directly. "Get the log." He went. She was assessing the port when she heard the lobby sounds get louder. Not the ordinary sounds of a busy hospital lobby, but something more percussive, more directional, the kind of acoustic event that happened when people stopped flowing through a space and started colliding in it. The bay doors swung open. Admiral Dole's aide, a young lieutenant who had the look of someone moving through a protocol, stepped in first. "We need to secure this patient and move," He's actively seizing, Callie said without looking up. You cannot move him. Ma'am, there's a security situation in the... I understand that. She found the anomalous line, traced it back, began the process of disconnecting the contaminated port with the focused efficiency of someone solving a problem rather than reacting to one. What was introduced into this line needs to be identified before we can counter it. If you move him right now, you're moving him into cardiac arrest in a hallway. The lieutenant stopped. She turned to the door and saw, through the bay window, the lobby, in a state that confirmed what her body had already told her was coming. 4 men in hospital scrubs, orderly uniforms, the kind that made people invisible in a hospital because every hospital had dozens, were moving with a coordination that had nothing to do with medical logistics. They weren't running, they were positioning. Corners, exits, the junction that controlled access to the trauma wing. That kind of positioning had a name. She knew it. She had been trained to execute it. Behind her, Trey came back with the medication log. She took it without looking, scanned the 1240 entry, found the name of the orderly who'd logged the secondary line maintenance. Thomas Arwick, she read aloud. Does anyone here know a Thomas Arwick? Silence. That's what I thought. She set the log on the counter, picked up the wall phone, and called the security desk. It rang 7 times. Nobody answered. She set the phone down. The lieutenant was watching her with the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment in real time. What's your name? He said. Reeves. Callie Reeves. Reeves, are you telling me? I'm telling you, this patient was dosed through a secondary IV line by someone who logged maintenance at 1240 and doesn't appear in your personnel documentation. I'm telling you, there are 4 individuals in your lobby who are not hospital employees and are staging for something that isn't a robbery. And I'm telling you that if the Admiral's security detail hasn't already secured the entrance routes from the west parking structure, that's where you're going to lose the perimeter. The lieutenant's hand was on his radio before she finished the sentence. From the corridor outside came the sound of something falling, heavier than a tray, more specific than furniture. And then voices rising in the sharp, bitten-off way people's voices rose when they had moved from concern into something harder. Callie Reeves looked once at the seizing patient, made a fast clinical decision, drew up the counteragent from what she had at hand, administered it, and watched the monitor. Watched the storm begin to slow. The bay doors swung open again, and the man who walked through them was the Rear Admiral himself, moving under his own power with 2 security personnel flanking him, and he was scanning the room with the automatic assessment of someone for whom every room was a tactical environment, and his eyes landed on Callie. He stopped. Not the stop of someone who had recognized a face. The stop of someone who had recognized something behind the face. A posture, a stillness, the specific quality of a person standing in a crisis without trembling. His eyes moved to her hands, to the IV line she'd disconnected and contained, to the monitor showing a rhythm that was, barely but genuinely, returning toward something sustainable. His voice, when it came, was low. Who is this nurse? Reeves, sir, the lieutenant said. Callie Reeves. That's not what I asked. He was still looking at her, not at her face exactly, at the scar that ran from her left wrist partway up her forearm, exposed where her scrub sleeve had ridden up during the IV work. A scar with a very specific shape that a very small number of people in the world would recognize as anything other than an accident. Admiral Dole's face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way faces changed in movies, just the specific quiet rearrangement of a man for whom a piece of a very long puzzle had just revealed its shape. And the shape was wrong in every way that mattered, wrong in a way that meant something he had been told 4 years ago was a lie. He said a word, a single word, quiet enough that only Callie could hear it. It was not her name. It was not the name on her nursing license or her personnel file or her social security records. It was a call sign, 2 syllables, something she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 4 years, and every carefully constructed layer of Callie Reeves, the nursing credentials, the Halcyon address, the 3 years of trauma bay shifts and East Wing triage rotations and cold break room coffee, every single layer went completely still. Because in the corridor outside, someone screamed, then the lights in the trauma wing went out, and in the sudden, absolute dark, She heard the sound she hadn't heard since a mountainside in a country she was never officially in. The specific, concussive pop of a flashbang going wide, followed by the coordinated movement of men who had trained for exactly this, rolling fast through a space they had already mapped. They hadn't come for the Admiral. They had come for her. The dark lasted 4 seconds. Callie was moving by the second one. She didn't think about it. Thinking was the wrong gear for this. Her body found the wall beside the medication cart, dropped below the line of the bay window, and pulled Admiral Dole down with her before his security personnel had fully processed what was happening. One of them reacted well. The other reached for a light switch, which was the wrong instinct, and she said down in a voice that carried the particular frequency of a direct order, not loud, not emotional, just final, and he went down. The patient on the gurney was still connected to the monitor. The monitor had battery backup. It screened through a pale blue glow across the bay, enough to see shapes. 4 people in the room. 5, counting the Admiral. Trey was under the counter near the supply wall, which was where she'd want him. The other nurse, a woman named Priya who'd been documenting at the far station, had pressed herself into the corner behind the crash cart. Good. Low profile, out of the fatal funnel. Callie counted the sounds from the corridor. 2 sets of footsteps, fast but controlled, not panicked. Tactical movement. They were working in pairs, which meant at minimum 4 individuals total, possibly 6 if they'd staged a secondary team at the stairwell entrance she'd identified 40 minutes ago when she'd still been trying to convince herself this was someone else's problem. The Admiral's breathing was even. She registered that with something adjacent to respect. He was afraid. She could feel it in the tension of his arm where she'd grabbed him. But he was managing it, which meant he'd been in bad rooms before and still had the wiring to function inside them. "How many are you?" she said. Quiet. Mouth close to his ear. "My detail is 4. 2 outside, 2 were with me." "The 2 outside are already off the board. That's why the lights went. They hit the external panel first." She wasn't guessing. It was the logical sequence. Take the exterior security offline before the flashbang, reduce the response window, create confusion inside before anyone could call coordinates. Standard playbook for a hit dressed as a facility incident. "Who are you?" he said. "Right now, I'm the person keeping you alive. We can work out the rest later." She heard one of his security personnel. The one who'd responded correctly. She thought his name was Vasquez from the aide's earlier reference. Shift his weight toward the door. "Don't open that door," she said. "I need to establish contact with—" "If you open that door, you are giving them a lit silhouette in a dark corridor, and they will put you down before you clear the frame." She kept her voice at the same level, not angry, not pleading. "They are not here for a hostage situation. They are here to eliminate. Do you understand the difference?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Then stay low and stay away from the door." She was already thinking past the door. The bay had 1 entry point, the double swing doors, and 1 secondary access. A supply corridor connection behind the medication wall that technically required a key card, but that she had propped open 3 months ago with a folded piece of tape over the latch because the lock mechanism was slow and she'd gotten tired of fumbling for her badge during codes. She'd reported the lock to facilities twice. Facilities had not fixed it. This was one of those moments where a small act of impatience became the difference between options and no options. She moved to Trey's position. He was pressed against the supply wall with his knees pulled up and his eyes wide but his hands steady, which told her what she needed to know about him. "There's a corridor through that door," she said. "The tape on the latch. Do you know about the tape?" "You're the one who put it there," he said. "Dottie complained about it at the shift meeting. It'll open without a key card. I need you to take Priya and move through that corridor to the staff stairwell, go up 2 floors, get to the ICU. ICU has its own security station and its own external line. You call the Halcyon Police, you call the county sheriff, you say active hostile event, Halcyon General, Trauma Wing, federal personnel on site. You say federal. That word matters. What about you? I'll be right behind you." She was not going to be right behind him. He probably knew that. He went anyway, because the alternative was staying in the dark with armed men in the corridor, and because she'd said it with enough conviction that it gave him permission to move. She watched them go. Priya made a sound, not quite a cry almost, and then controlled it and followed Trey through the supply door. The door clicked behind them. Callie turned back to the bay. "Tulk, you set a call sign," she said to the Admiral. "Earlier, when you saw me." He was quiet for 2 seconds. "Yes. That call sign belongs to a person who died 4 years ago on a classified extraction in Kashari province. That's what the official report says." "I know what the report says." "Then you know why I'm surprised to be having this conversation." She was watching the gap under the bay doors. The light from the corridor was wrong, too flat, which meant they'd killed the emergency secondaries too, which meant they'd had inside access to the facility systems, which meant this had been planned for longer than the Admiral's arrival today. "I authorized that operation," he said. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite guilt, but was in the same neighborhood. "The extraction plan was mine. The extraction plan left my unit on the ground for 19 hours past the pickup window while someone rerouted the QRF to a secondary objective that didn't exist." Silence. "There were 7 of us," she said. "I'm the one having this conversation. The other 6 are not." More silence, the kind that confirmed rather than denied. "I didn't know," he said. "I want you to understand that. I didn't know about the rerouting until 8 months after the fact, and by then the report had been filed and you had been declared KIA. Yes." She moved to the crash cart, opened the bottom drawer, found what she was looking for. A scalpel still in its sterile packaging, a length of IV tubing, 2 saline bags. Not weapons in any conventional sense, but she was already working out how the room could become something other than a trap if she controlled the variables. "I've spent 3 years trying to find out who rerouted that QRF," Dole said. "I'm here because the federal investigation I've been cooperating with is close, 2 weeks away from indictments, and apparently someone knows that." "Apparently?" She looked at him directly. "Who else knew you were coming to Halcyon today?" "My aide, the 2-man advanced security team, the transport coordinator at the base. The advanced security team that's currently off the board." He understood what she was saying. His jaw tightened. One of those 4, or someone those 4 talked to, or someone who accessed the scheduling system. The logistics of that question don't matter right now. She moved to the wall beside the door. What matters is that they staged this as a hospital security incident rather than a direct hit, which tells me they want it to look chaotic. Accident. Collateral event during a security breach. That gives them time to clean up before federal investigators can establish a chain of custody. The patient on the gurney made a sound. Low, confused, the sound of someone surfacing from the induced state. The monitor showed a rhythm that was holding. The counteragent was working. "He's coming around," she said. "He can't be here when this moves. He's a federal witness. He's a target. Same problem, different framing." She looked at Vasquez. "Is there a second way out of this building that doesn't go through the main corridor structure?" Vasquez thought. "Loading dock, south side, but that's 2 floors down and through a service elevator that runs on a separate power circuit from the main grid," she finished. "I know, I've worked here for 3 years. She looked at him steadily. "Can you get him there if I give you a clear window?" "Depends on how long the window is. 90 seconds, maybe 100. That's not a lot." "No," she said. "It isn't." I'm done. The door came open at 14:23, according to the clock on the monitor that she checked once out of habit. She'd heard them stack outside, the shift in acoustics that happened when bodies filled a corridor and stopped moving, and she'd positioned herself behind the crash cart with the IV line in her left hand and the saline bag in her right, and the specific, particular stillness of someone who had done variations of this before in places that would never make it into any official record. The door opened inward. The first man through was moving fast and low, with the professional confidence of someone who had done room clearances and expected the room to behave like rooms did when they'd been softened up by the prior preparation. Darkness, civilians, no armed response. He got 3 steps in before Callie swung the saline bag into his face. It wasn't elegant. That was the thing about real violence. It was never elegant. It was weight and timing and the willingness to commit before the other person expected commitment. The bag connected with enough force to break his nose and redirect his momentum, and she was already past him, had his weapon arm locked and the wrist at an angle that the joint didn't accommodate, and when he dropped, she put him down the rest of the way with a knee and held the position until he stopped moving. The second man cleared the door 2 seconds behind the first. He found the first man on the floor and Callie in the wrong position. Not where the sweep had told him to expect a civilian, not down and away from threat, but between him and the only thing in the room that still mattered. He hesitated for less than a second. That was enough. She used the IV tubing, looped fast, tension applied before he could recalibrate, and the next 14 seconds were not something she would have described to anyone who asked, because the description would have required explaining things about herself she had spent 4 years making sure nobody needed to know. When it was done, she was breathing harder, and her left forearm had a new mark where a watch had caught the skin, and both men were secured and down, and Vasquez was already moving the Admiral's witness through the supply corridor with the Admiral behind him. She stood in the dim blue light of the monitor. The patient on the gurney looked at her with the unfocused expression of someone who had woken from a pharmaceutical nightmare and was not entirely certain the next few minutes were real. "You're in a hospital," she said. "You're going to be okay. Don't move." He blinked at her. "Who?" "It doesn't matter." She checked the door. "Don't move." She went to the window. Through the bay glass, she could see the lobby in pieces. One of the suited men down near the reception desk, Dole's remaining security personnel engaged with someone near the elevator bank. Gregor Fitch pressed against the administrator's door with his hands over his head in the posture of a man who had not prepared for this particular type of workday. She needed to know how many were left. She needed a higher vantage point. She needed, and this was the part she hadn't fully thought through, to decide whether she was going to do what she could feel her entire operational history pushing her toward, or whether she was going to go up 2 floors to the ICU and stand behind the security station with Trey and Priya and wait for the county sheriff. The overhead PA system crackled. Someone had found the PA, not hospital personnel. The voice had the compressed, deliberate quality of someone reading from a prepared statement rather than making a live announcement. "Attention staff, this facility is now under a security lockdown. All personnel are directed to shelter in place. This is a federal operation. Anyone who interferes with authorized federal personnel will be subject to—" She stopped listening. Not a federal operation. Federal operations didn't cut the lights. They didn't use that phrasing. They didn't put 4 men in orderly scrubs and route contamination through a secondary IV port. She knew what federal operations looked like. She had been part of enough of them. This was a cleanup. Someone had decided that the risk of the Admiral's testimony was high enough to justify the exposure of the operation that eliminated it, which meant the indictments were closer than 2 weeks. Which meant someone on the inside of the federal investigation had run a calculation and decided a messy, visible operation was still better than what happened if Dole talked. She found the stairwell. She went up. Plus, the 3rd floor was quieter. ICU was at the far end of the north corridor, and she moved through the dark with the specific pattern of someone navigating by sound and peripheral vision rather than sight. A skill that came from particular kinds of training, in particular kinds of places, and did not announce itself as unusual until someone watched it happen and realized they were watching something that normal people didn't do. She was halfway down the corridor when the door behind her opened. Not a threat. She'd turned before she thought about turning, had assessed the silhouette and the posture and the lack of tactical movement in the same half-second, and what she found was a Marine. Full dress. Not the same dress as the Admiral. This was working dress, functional, and the man wearing it was roughly her age and built like someone who had decided very early in life that he would meet his environment on his own terms. He had come from the stairwell, which meant he'd been outside the primary incident zone and had worked his way up through a different access route. He stood in the corridor and looked at her, not with the recalibration she'd seen in Vasquez, not with Dole's careful recognition, with something more immediate. "You're the nurse," he said. "Yes." "You took down 2 of them in the trauma bay." She waited. "I was watching through the bay window." He said it without apology. "I came up the east stairwell when the PA feed went live. I'm Colonel Mac Rourke. I'm the commander attached to Admiral Dole's convoy. He paused. I've seen people move the way you moved in that bay. Not a lot of people. And not nurses. She held the silence for a moment. How many are left on the floor, she said. 2 in the lobby. One I'm not sure about. He went into the administrative wing and I lost the visual. He looked at her steadily. I had a conversation with the Admiral by radio 30 seconds ago. He told me your call sign. She felt the sentence land. He shouldn't have done that, she said. Probably not. Rourke looked at her with something that was not pity and not admiration, but a specific form of professional assessment. Are you going to tell me it's wrong? She didn't answer that. The one in the administrative wing, she said. He's not a tactical asset. He's the handler. He'll be destroying records and pulling the documentation trail while the others keep the active incident going. Rourke's expression shifted slightly. Destroying which records? The authorization chain for this operation. Whatever connects the people who ordered this to the people who are executing it. She looked down the corridor toward the administrative wing junction. If he gets out with that, the indictments fall apart. The 2 in the lobby become isolated actors with no traceable command structure. Rourke was quiet for exactly long enough to understand what she was saying. The ICU security station called County, he said. ETA is 12 minutes. 12 minutes is enough time. I'm not going to ask you to... You're not asking, she said. She was already moving toward the administrative wing. She was 4 steps down the corridor when Rourke said quietly, Overwatch. She stopped, turned. I'll take the lobby access point. Make sure nobody else comes up behind you. He said it the way people who had worked together said things, without elaboration, without justification, just the operational fact. Watch your left side. Building schematics put a secondary door at the back of the billing office. He may have already mapped it. She nodded once. She went. The administrative wing was darker than the patient floors. Fewer emergency lights, longer intervals between the battery-backed units. She moved through the intervals with the particular patience of someone who had learned that darkness was not an obstacle but a variable, and that the difference between threat and advantage was almost always a matter of whose training had made the darkness familiar. She found him in the records annex. He was not military. She knew that in the first half-second. The way he held himself was wrong for it, the posture of someone who had been trained in threat response, but as a secondary skill rather than a foundation. He was civilian intelligence, or contractor, which in her experience was often the same thing wearing slightly better clothes. He had a tablet and a portable drive and was working through the hospital's administrative server connection with the focused efficiency of someone executing a task they'd rehearsed. He heard her. He turned. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he said, with the specific calm of someone who had a secondary exit memorized and a running calculation of whether to use it, "You don't know what you're involved in." "I have a fairly good idea," she said. "You're a nurse," he said. The word the way Westbrook had used it that morning, defining, diminishing. She noticed it and noted it and did not react to it. "Keep talking," she said. He reached behind him. He did not reach the secondary exit. When the county sheriff's first unit came through the main hospital entrance 11 minutes later, they found Halcyon General in a state that the first deputy on scene would later describe in his report as unlike anything in his 8 years of service. 2 men secured in Trauma Bay 1, 1 in the administrative records annex, 2 more in the lobby in varying states of incapacitation, and a federal witness being escorted from the south loading dock by a Marine colonel and 2 of the Admiral's surviving security personnel. The first deputy also noted a trauma nurse in scrubs standing at the nursing station on the ground floor, writing in a patient chart with the same deliberate handwriting she apparently used for everything, who looked up when he came through the doors and said calmly, "I need you to secure the administrative records annex on the 3rd floor before anyone accesses the server terminal. The tablet on the desk is evidence. Don't let anyone touch it." He had started to ask her who she was. She had looked at him with those flat, careful eyes and said, "Callie Reeves, I'm a trauma nurse here." And before he could ask the obvious follow-up, because the obvious follow-up was gathering behind his eyes like weather, a voice came from the loading dock corridor. Admiral Marcus Dole, walking under his own power, looking at her the way you looked at something you had been wrong about for a very long time. Deputy, he said, without looking at the man, everything this woman tells you is a direct order. Do you understand me? The deputy looked between them. Yes, sir, he said slowly. Callie went back to the chart. She documented the secondary IV contamination, the counteragent dosage, the timeline of intervention, and the patient's current stable rhythm with the same careful precision she brought to every chart in the same neat, specific language, as if the last 3 hours had been a complicated shift rather than a reckoning 4 years in the making. She was almost finished when Dottie Marsh appeared in the doorway. Dottie, who had been in the East Wing when the lockdown hit. Dottie, who had clearly come through whatever version of events she'd experienced and arrived here in the specific state of someone who had been frightened and had processed the fear into something harder and more useful. She looked at the lobby. She looked at the deputy. She looked at Callie. Reeves, she said. Hey, Dot. Are you going to tell me what just happened? Callie set the pen down, looked at the chart, looked at Dottie. Later, she said. Right now, I need to know if the patient in Bay 4, the woman from this morning, is still in the East Wing. Dottie blinked. She is. She needs a follow-up assessment. She's been alone in there for 4 hours. Callie stood. Someone should check on her. She picked up her badge lanyard, started toward the East Wing. Callie, Dottie's voice stopped her. Something in the tone, not confused now, but certain. The voice of someone who had just assembled a picture from pieces she'd been looking at for 3 years without knowing they formed one. Who are you? Callie paused. She looked back once. The Admiral was watching her from across the lobby with the expression of a man who had spent 4 years carrying a weight he'd been told was permanent, and who had just been informed by circumstance that the math had been wrong all along. She turned back toward the East Wing and said, quietly enough that only Dottie could hear, Right now, I'm the nurse who needs to check on a patient. She walked through the door. Behind her, in the lobby, 2 more federal vehicles were pulling into the hospital drive, and one of them carried the kind of men who did not announce themselves and did not ask questions they didn't already know the answers to. And in the hand of the lead agent, as he stepped out into the halcyon afternoon, was a photograph that was 4 years old and slightly worn at the edges from being carried in the same interior jacket pocket for a very long time. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the hospital entrance. He put the photograph away. And then his radio crackled with a voice, Rourke's voice, from the 3rd floor, saying 4 words that made the agent close his eyes briefly and then open them and walk toward the entrance with the changed energy of someone who had just been told that the thing they'd spent 4 years looking for was already inside. She's here, Rourke said. She's already here. The agent's name was Saul Vader, and he had the particular economy of movement that came from years of working in spaces where drawing attention was the same as making a mistake. He came through the hospital entrance without announcing himself to the deputy at the door. He came through the lobby without stopping at the reception desk. He found Rourke in the 3rd floor corridor, and they stood together for 30 seconds and had a conversation that involved no unnecessary words, which was the kind of conversation Rourke was built for. Where is she? Vetter said. East Wing, patient follow-up. She went to check on a patient. Yes, Vetter absorbed that. After everything that just happened in this building, she went to check on a patient. She did. He was quiet for a moment. What's her read on the situation? She identified the handler before I did. She identified the secondary IV contamination before the medical team. She identified the staging pattern in the lobby inside the first 60 seconds of the incident. Rourke looked at him steadily. She also told me the one in the admin wing would be destroying records. She was right. Was he? Tablets bagged. Our forensics team will tell us what he got out before she stopped him. Vetter nodded slowly. And the Admiral. Loading dock. His witness is stable. Your people have them. Good. He turned toward the East Wing corridor. I need to talk to her. She knows, Rourke said. Vetter stopped. She knows you're here, Rourke said. She knew before you walked in. I don't know how. I didn't tell her. The Admiral didn't tell her. But when I came back through the lobby, she was already writing in that chart, and she said without looking up, tell your federal contact I'll be available in 15 minutes. Vetter considered this. She said 15 minutes. Yes. He checked his watch. How long ago was that? Rourke almost smiled. 13 minutes. She was in Bay 4 when he found her. The woman, her name was Lorraine, Callie had finally gotten that much, was sitting upright with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of water in her hands that she'd drunk about half of. Her color was better. Her eyes were tracking. She was not talking much, but she was listening, which was different from when Callie had left her 4 hours ago, when she hadn't been doing either. Callie was sitting in the chair beside the bed, not standing, not in clinical posture, just sitting, like a person rather than a professional. And she was talking about nothing in particular. The water pressure in the east wing being unreliable. The way the supply room always ran out of the specific gauge of suture she needed on busy Tuesdays. Small, inconsequential things that required no response and put nothing on Lorraine except the sound of a voice that wasn't demanding anything from her. Vetter stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. She said, without turning, "Give me 2 more minutes." He gave her 2 more minutes. When she came out, she looked at his credentials, which he offered without being asked, and she said, "SAC Vetter. I wondered when your office would close the loop. You knew we were running an investigation. I knew someone had to be. The Admiral doesn't travel with that kind of security for a routine hospital visit." She moved to the nursing station and sat on the edge of the desk rather than in the chair, which put her at eye level with him rather than below it. Small thing. Deliberate. "What do you need from me?" "Everything," he said, "starting 4 years ago." That's a long conversation. "I have time." "I don't." She looked down this corridor toward the trauma wing, where county deputies and 2 of Vetter's agents were processing the scene. "I have a shift that technically ended 2 hours ago, and a department that's going to need a functioning nurse tonight because whatever else is happening in this building, people are still going to come through that door with emergencies." She looked back at him. "Give me the short version of what you actually need right now." Vetter studied her. "The operation in Kashari province, the QRF reroute, what you know, and what you can prove." "Those are 2 different lists." "I know. I want both." She was quiet for a moment. "The no list is long. The prove list is shorter but sufficient." She met his eyes. "I've been building it for 4 years. I didn't come to Halcyon by accident. I came here because the county records office has a specific set of archived procurement documents that connect a defense contractor called Vorlan Group to the logistical chain that managed QRF deployment in that operational sector. Those documents have been sitting in a physical archive that nobody's digitized because the county budget hasn't funded it." A pause. "I've been in that archive. I've made copies. They're in a location I can give you." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when someone said something that changed the shape of a room. "You've been here 3 years, Vetter said. "Yes." "You came here for the documents." "I came here because I needed somewhere to be. And because the documents were here, and because trauma nursing was the skill set that made the most sense for a civilian identity." She said it without apology. "One thing doesn't exclude the other." He looked at her for a long moment. "The people who tried to kill the Admiral today, and you, they're going to know the operation failed within the hour, which means they're going to move to damage control, which means any physical evidence that isn't in federal custody in the next—" "I know," she said. "I've known that since the PA announcement. We should leave in the next 20 minutes. We. I'm not sending you to the archive alone. You won't know what you're looking at." Vetter nodded once. "Okay. I need to make one call first." "To who?" "Dottie." She was already reaching for the desk phone. "Someone has to cover the East Wing." The county records office was a 12-minute drive from Halcyon General in the building behind the old courthouse that the city had been planning to renovate for longer than anyone could remember and had not yet gotten around to. It was locked at this hour, but Vetter's credentials opened it, and the archivist on call, a retired schoolteacher named Barb, who handled the evening access requests and did not appear to find anything unusual about a federal agent and a trauma nurse arriving at 6:40 p.m. requesting access to procurement records, led them to the sub-basement without comment. Callie found the section in under 4 minutes. She moved through the shelving with the map already in her head. not looking for labels, not checking indices. She'd been here enough times that the physical memory lived in her hands rather than her conscious recall. "Here," she said. She pulled a banker's box from the third shelf, set it on the work table, and opened it. Vetter looked inside. Photocopies. Originals beneath them. A series of documents that appeared on first glance to be standard defense procurement records, contracts, logistics schedules, vendor certifications. "The Vorlon Group's contract for QRF support in sectors 7 through 12, she said, pointing. "It's a standard service agreement on the surface, but look at the amendment dated October of that year, subsection C." He found it, read it. "They rerouted the QRF deployment authority," he said. "They contracted it. The authorization to redirect rapid response assets in those sectors was transferred from the military command chain to a private contractor coordination office. Vorlon Group." She said it evenly, which meant that when the order came to reroute our QRF to a secondary objective, it didn't come through the Admiral's office. It came through a civilian contractor who had been granted the authority to issue that kind of redirect. And the Admiral never knew, because the contract amendment was processed at a subdepartmental level and never escalated for senior review. It was buried in a stack of routine procurement modifications. She looked at the document. "It took me 8 months to find this. I'd been looking for a military order that went wrong. I should have been looking for a business contract that worked exactly as intended." Vetter sat down. He was looking at the document with the expression of someone who had been building a case around a slightly wrong premise and was now watching the correct premise assemble itself. "This expands the scope considerably," he said. "Yes. This isn't just an assassination attempt on the Admiral. This is a procurement fraud operation that had its own internal security apparatus. The people who tried to kill him today, and me, they're not rogue operators. They're asset protection. Part of the contract." She pulled a second set of documents from the box. "These are the billing records. Vorlon Group invoiced the government for operational security consulting in the months following the Kashari operation. That's the cleanup. That's how they ran it as a line item." Vetter was already on his phone. She heard him give the location to someone and say, "Full forensic team," and chain of custody protocol from the ground up, before she stepped away and let him work. She walked to the far end of the archive and stood in the quiet. The sub-basement smelled like old paper and the particular metallic damp of spaces that had been sealed and reopened many times. She had spent hours in this room over the past 3 years. She had sat at this work table with photocopied documents and tried to build a thing that was not revenge. She'd had to be honest with herself that it wasn't purely that, but accountability. The specific procedural documented kind that didn't burn anything down without leaving a record of why the fire had been necessary. She thought about the 6 names she carried. Not metaphorically. She carried them in a specific way, not tattooed, not written anywhere, just held in a particular part of her memory that she had kept clear and available across 4 years of trauma bays and East Wing triage rotations and cold coffee in break rooms. 6 people who had deserved better than the fabricated report that had buried them under a classification level. She thought about Lorraine, upstairs, drinking half a cup of water and listening to someone talk about plumbing. She thought about Trey, who had taken Priya up the stairwell without questioning her and had called the county sheriff and probably saved the Admiral's life by giving Rourke the clear timeline he needed to navigate the building. She thought about Dottie. She was still thinking when Vetter appeared at the end of the aisle. "My team is 20 minutes out," he said. "We'll secure the archive and move the originals to federal custody tonight." He looked at her. "I need a formal statement. Everything. Kashari, the 4 years, what you've built here, what happened today." "I know. It's going to take a while." "I know that too." He studied her. "Are you all right?" "No," she said, simply and without drama. "But that's a different question from whether I'm functional, and the answer to the functional question is yes." He nodded. He seemed to understand the distinction. They went back to the work table, and she began. The formal statement took 3 hours, conducted in a conference room at the Halcyon County Sheriff's Office with Victor and 2 of his agents and a court reporter who typed with the relentless speed of someone who had stopped being surprised by human testimony a long time ago. Callie spoke in the flat, precise language of an incident report, Dates, locations, sequences, the specific technical details that gave a legal document its weight. She did not perform emotion. She was not unaffected, but the line between those two things was a thing she'd learned to manage the way she managed a compromised airway, with technique and controlled timing and the knowledge that letting it go at the wrong moment made the problem worse for everyone in the room. At the end of the third hour, Vetter set down his pen. The Kashari documents, combined with what we already have, he said, changed the scope of the indictment significantly. We're not looking at 2 or 3 individuals anymore. We're looking at a systemic procurement fraud operation with an internal enforcement arm. He paused. The contractor who introduced the compound into the IV line today, he was Vorland Group. His employee ID in the hospital system was falsified, but his actual employment record traces to a Vorland subsidiary. Which means today wasn't an improvised response, Callie said. They had a standing protocol for eliminating threats to the operation. They'd used it before. We think so. We're working backward. He looked at her steadily. The people who declared you KIA 4 years ago, whoever made that call, it may not have been administrative error. She'd known that. She'd known it for most of the 4 years. Hearing it confirmed by someone with a federal credential was different from knowing it privately, in the same way that a diagnosis felt different from a symptom. I want the names, she said. I know. Not for anything extra legal. I want to know who signed the report. We'll get there, he said. She was back at Halcyon General by 11 p.m. She didn't have to be. Vetter's team had everything they needed for the immediate process. She could have gone to her apartment, the second-floor walk-up on Meridian Street with the fire escape she'd confirmed as an exit route on day 1 and the kitchen window that looked directly onto the building's east approach, and slept for whatever remained of the night. She went back because the hospital was still partially in crisis mode, and because Dottie had texted her twice, and because there was a 17-year-old in Bay 3 who had come in at 8 p.m. with a penetrating abdominal wound from a factory equipment incident, and whose surgeon had the notes she'd left, but not the context. She changed into a fresh set of scrubs she kept in her locker. She pulled her hair back. She washed her hands for the correct length of time. She was reviewing the abdominal case when Dr. Harlan Westbrook walked into the nursing station. He had the look of a man who had spent several hours being questioned and had not enjoyed the experience. His shirt was wrinkled, his collar open in a way that would have offended his earlier self. He had clearly been told something that had rearranged his understanding of the day's events. He stood at the station and looked at her. She looked at the chart. The federal agents, he said. They asked me about the VIP patient, about who had access to the bay. They asked about the physician who had cleared all nursing staff from the primary bay between 9 and noon. A pause. They asked specifically about whether the personnel reassignment was documented and who authorized it, and whether there was a clinical basis for it. She turned a page in the chart. Reeves. His voice had something unfamiliar in it. Not quite humility. Closer to the thing that lived just beside humility, in the space where a person recognized they had exposed themselves. I didn't know the patient was at risk when I made the reassignment decision. I want you to understand that. She set the chart down. She looked at him with the same direct, even attention she gave to monitors and medication logs and the faces of patients who were trying to tell her something they didn't have the words for. I know you didn't know, she said. That's a separate issue from whether the decision was defensible. He said nothing. The patient needed pacing at 8:23. I identified that. You overrode the intervention for non-clinical reasons and ordered my reassignment in front of federal personnel while a man's rhythm was compromised. She said it the way she would document it, without heat, without satisfaction. That's the sequence. What the federal investigation does with the access logs from the patient bay during the window when he was dosed, that's not something I control. Westbrook's jaw worked. I've been the chair of this department for 11 years, he said. I know. I have never had a nursing staff member challenge a call that was wrong, she said. I know that too. He stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable, for either of them, but differently. Then he left. She went back to the chart. She was deep in the surgical notes when Dottie appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, from the break room machine that made it properly, not the waiting room version. She set one in front of Callie without comment. Callie picked it up. "The federal agents," Dottie said. "They took 3 of the lobbymen, the 2 from the Bay, the one from admin." She paused. "They told Fitch the hospital may be designated a federal evidence site for up to 90 days. That's probably right. They also told him that the personnel reassignment Westbrook ordered this morning would be included in the administrative review." Dottie was quiet for a moment. "Fitch came to me and asked if I had documentation." "Do you?" "I have everything." Dottie said it with the flat certainty of a woman who had been a charge nurse for 20 years and had survived that long by understanding exactly which pieces of paper needed to exist. Every shift log, every reassignment note, the original triage rotation order with his signature. A beat. "I've always had everything." Callie looked at her. Dottie looked back with the particular expression of someone who had been watching a complicated situation develop for 3 years and had been hoping, in the specific quiet way that experienced people hoped, that the person at the center of it knew what they were doing. "Go home," Dottie said. "I'll cover till 6. The abdominal case, I've handled abdominals before. Go home." Callie thought about Meridian Street, the fire escape, the kitchen window with its east approach view. "Not yet," she said. She went back to the chart. She was there 40 minutes later when Rourke found her. He came in not through the main entrance but through the ambulance bay, the way someone came in who knew the building now, who had moved through it under pressure and learned its geography from the inside. He was still in working dress. He looked like a man who had not slept and was not planning to, and had made his peace with that. He stood at the station and said, "We have a problem." She set the pen down. "Vetter's forensics team found something in the admin archive," he said. "In the tablet. The handler got one file out before you stopped him. One transmission. What was in it? We don't know yet. The transmission was encrypted, but the timestamp is before you reached the admin wing, which means whatever he sent it when he still believed the operation was running as planned." She thought about that. "If the operation was running as planned," she said, "the file was a confirmation signal. He transmitted a status update to the command layer. Someone above him received confirmation that the primary targets were either contained or eliminated." "Yes." "Which means whoever is above him thinks the operation succeeded." "Right. And when they find out it didn't, they'll know the file was the last clean communication. They'll know everything after that moment is compromised." Rourke's voice was even, but his eyes weren't. "They'll know the archive has been accessed. They'll know we have the Vorlon documents." She understood what he was saying before he said the rest of it. "Vetter is pulling in the indictment timeline," Rourke continued. "He's trying to move to arrest warrants before the command layer has time to coordinate a response. But there's a name on the Vorlon contract, the executive signatory on the amendment you found, and that person has resources. Legal, financial, logistical." "How high?" she said. Rourke looked at her. "How high in the structure does this go?" He was quiet for long enough that the quiet told her more than the answer did. "Vetter flagged 2 individuals," Rourke said. "One is a senior partner at a defense law firm that has represented Vorlon Group in every federal contract dispute for the past decade." He paused. "The other is a sitting member of the Senate Armed Services Committee." The break room coffee machine made a sound. The overhead lights buzzed at their usual low frequency. Down the corridor, somewhere in the east wing, a monitor beeped in the steady, reliable rhythm of a body doing what bodies were supposed to do. Callie Reeves sat very still. A senator. The structure went to a senator, which meant the Kashari operation, the buried report, the QRF reroute, the 6 names she had been carrying for 4 years. All of it had been covered at the level where coverage was not only possible, but institutionally protected. Which also meant that the transmission the handler had sent, the one file that had gone out before she'd reached the admin wing, had been received by someone with the standing to respond to it, not with panic, but with the specific, deliberate machinery of institutional power. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The number was one she hadn't seen in 4 years. A number she had memorized and never entered into any device, that lived only in the part of her memory she kept clear for things that mattered. She looked at the number for a long moment. She looked at Rourke. My phone just received a call from a number that shouldn't exist anymore, she said. It's from a line that was officially decommissioned after Kashari. It belonged to the intelligence liaison who managed communications for our unit during the operation. That liaison was listed as killed in action, she said. Same as me. The phone buzzed again. And in the specific quiet of that nursing station, with Rourke watching her and the monitor beeping down the corridor and the whole weight of 4 years and 6 names and a Senate seat pressing against the moment, Callie Reeves reached down and answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Low, careful, with the specific compression of someone speaking through a device that was routing the call through multiple nodes before it arrived anywhere near a real number. Callie knew the sound. She'd used the same kind of setup herself, in a different life. You answered, the voice said. You called. A pause. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either. Callie stood and walked to the far end of the nursing station, putting distance between herself and Rourke. Not because she didn't trust him, but because this conversation needed space to breathe before she let anyone else inside it. Nadia. The name she'd used for the woman across 4 years of carrying it, not her real name. She didn't know the real name. She knew the call sign, the communication protocols, the voice. The rest had been need to know, and apparently she hadn't needed to know. You're in Halcyon, Nadia said. I know about today. Then you know it didn't go the way they planned. I know. A brief pause. I've been watching the Vorland contract for 18 months. I'm the one who flagged the procurement trail to a federal contact 8 months ago. That's why Vetter's investigation exists. Callie absorbed that. You're the source, she said. One of them. And you've been alive this whole time. Yes. The word came out with something underneath it. Not guilt, exactly. The weight of a decision that had been made under specific circumstances and had cost something real. I couldn't surface. The people above Vorlon had eyes inside the military records system. If I resurfaced before the legal framework was solid enough to protect the disclosure, they'd have buried it and buried me with it. So you waited. I waited. Callie looked at the wall. She thought about the things she'd been told about patience, that it wasn't the same as acceptance, that it was its own form of action, that the ability to hold still while everything you wanted moved at its own pace was a skill rather than a surrender. She'd believed that when she'd said it to herself. She believed it less reliably when someone else had made the same choice, and the cost had been borne by the people still waiting. You could have told me, Callie said. No, I couldn't. You were the most valuable asset in the entire case, and you didn't know it. If you'd known I was alive and building toward this, you would have moved differently. They'd have made you. It was logical. She hated that it was logical. What do you need from me right now? She said. Nothing. I need you to listen. The line was clean, but Nadia's voice had the tightly managed quality of someone who was saying the important part after a long approach. The senator, Aldrin Brace, Armed Services Committee, he received the transmission from the handler. He knows the hospital operation failed. He has a response prepared. He's had it prepared, I think, since the indictment timeline started to compress. What kind of response? The kind that doesn't involve a lawyer. A pause. He has a contact inside the federal court system, a clerk with access to the sealed filing dockets. He's going to move to have the evidentiary basis for Vetter's warrants challenged on classification grounds before the warrants can be executed. If he gets a sympathetic judge to hear the classification argument, everything from the archive gets sealed pending national security review. That process takes between 8 and 14 months. During which Brace retires from his committee seat, the Vorlon contracts are restructured under a different corporate name, and the principals disperse. Yes. How long do we have? The court contact files the challenge in the morning. Vetter has to move tonight. Callie turned. Rourke was at the end of the station, watching her with the patience of someone who understood that the information would arrive when it arrived, and that hovering didn't accelerate that. She looked at him and said, "Get Vetter, right now." He was already reaching for his radio. She put the phone back to her ear. "Nadia, I need you on record. I need a formal statement from you to Vetter's team. Your identity, your role in the Kashari operation, your 18 months of documentation. Everything." Silence. I know what it is. I know what it costs. She kept her voice even. But if you don't surface tonight with what you have, Brace files that challenge in 6 hours and we lose the window. You built this case. You don't get to build it and then not be in the room when it matters. A longer silence. I'm in Columbus, Nadia said. 2 hours out. Get here in 90 minutes. Callie, 90 minutes, Nadia. She ended the call. Mab. Vetter took the information with the focused calm of someone who had trained for the specific experience of a case expanding faster than the planned timeline. He made 4 calls in the first 10 minutes, 2 to his own office, 1 to the federal courthouse duty officer, 1 to a number Callie didn't recognize but whose area code placed it in Washington. He paced the length of the corridor outside the nursing station while he talked and came back in with the particular set of someone who had used the last of the easy options and was now working with what remained. I can file for the warrants tonight, he said, but the classification challenge Brace is planning, it's not baseless. The Kashari documents are classified. If he gets the right judge to hear the argument before we can execute, the archive gets locked. Can you accelerate the warrant application? I need a federal magistrate willing to hear it at midnight. Is that possible? Technically, not easily. He looked at her. The second source you mentioned, the one who's 2 hours out. If she has documentation independent of the county archive, I have a stronger basis for the emergency filing. 2 independent evidentiary streams is different from 1. She'll be here, Callie said. He nodded. Started on his phone again. Rourke appeared at her shoulder. Brace is going to know Nadia surfaced, he said. Quiet, not for the room. The moment she files a statement, she's no longer a ghost. He'll know his inside source at the court isn't the only problem. I know. He may try to move against her directly. I know that too. She thought for a moment. Can you get a protective detail to the Columbus address she called from? I can ask. I don't have the authority to. Vetter does. She turned. Vetter, I need a protective detail on a civilian witness in Columbus. Now, not when she arrives here. He looked up from his phone, assessed the request in about 2 seconds, made another call. She went back to the nursing station. She sat down and pulled the chart she'd been reviewing before Rourke had arrived. The abdominal case, the 17-year-old, the surgical notes that still needed her attention, and she read through them with the part of her brain that existed independently from everything else that was happening, the part that had learned to compartmentalize not as a coping mechanism, but as a clinical necessity, because patients needed her present even when the other parts of her life were on fire. The case was straightforward. The surgeon had done good work. The kid would be okay. She documented her nursing assessment, flagged 2 items for the morning team, and closed the chart. Trey appeared at the end of the corridor. Off shift now, in civilian clothes, but he'd clearly come back in because the hospital felt unfinished. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had run a stairwell in the dark and called the county sheriff and spent the rest of the evening being debriefed by federal agents and had arrived at the far side of all of it still upright, which was its own form of strength. You should go home, she told him. I wanted to make sure you were. He stopped, recalibrated. I wanted to make sure the department was okay. The department is okay. He nodded, didn't move. Those men in the bay, the ones you. He stopped again. I've been a nurse for 2 years. I've had hard shifts. I've had codes. I've had combative patients. I've had all of that. But what I watched you do in that bay was, Trey, different. Yes, she said. It was different. And you did exactly what needed doing when I asked you to. That's what matters. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and went home. Nadia arrived at 12:47 a.m. She was not what Callie had constructed from the voice and the operational history and the 4 years of imagining. She was shorter than expected, somewhere in her mid-40s, with the look of someone who had been living carefully for a long time. The specific kind of careful that showed in posture and eye line and the way she checked every exit in a room without appearing to check them. She had a bag with her, and the bag had weight to it that wasn't clothing. She stopped when she saw Callie. They looked at each other across the lobby of Halcyon General at 12:47 in the morning, with the county deputies still at the door and the trauma wing lit up behind Callie and 4 years of everything between them. You look different, Nadia said. You look exactly the same, Callie said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Nadia said, I'm sorry. About the 6. Yeah. I'm sorry about you too. About the years. Let's not do that right now, Callie said. Not harshly. Just the pragmatism of someone who knew that the accounting would take longer than they had, and that starting it at the wrong moment would spend the wrong kind of energy. Vetter's in the conference room. He needs everything. Nadia nodded, straightened slightly, pulled the bag higher on her shoulder. Everything's in here, she said. 18 months. The full Vorlon corporate structure, the shell companies, the payments to the QRF coordinator, 3 separate communications logs that trace Brace's involvement back to the original contract amendment. She paused. And the name of the person who signed the order declaring you and the unit KIA. It wasn't the Admiral. Callie went still. Who? A colonel named Ferris Dunn. He was managing the operational oversight for the sector at the time. He's been retired for 2 years. Medical, they said. He's been living in Scottsdale under his pension and a consulting arrangement with... Nadia's mouth did something brief and bitter. Vorlon Group. The name settled. Ferris Dunn. She didn't know the face. Dunn had been 2 layers above her direct chain, but she knew the signature. She'd seen it on enough operational authorizations during the deployment that the name had embedded itself the way logistical details embedded. Not memorable, exactly, just present. The kind of thing you stored without knowing you'd stored it because the operational environment demanded you track everything. She'd been storing Ferris Dunn's name for 4 years without knowing she had it. Take it to Vetter, she said. She walked Nadia to the conference room and left her there with Vetter and his agents and didn't go in. She went to the break room. She sat down with a cup of water. Not coffee, she was done with coffee for the night, and she sat in the specific quiet of a room that was designed for people in between crises, and she let the shape of the thing clarify. Brace, done. Vorlon Group, a procurement contract that had been structured to give a private company operational authority over military rapid response assets. 6 people dead in a mountain valley in a country that didn't appear on any operational record she'd been allowed to keep. 4 years of trauma bays and bank documents and the specific discipline of living parallel to the truth without becoming it. And now, at 12:53 a.m. in a break room in Halcyon, Ohio, the shape was finally whole. She was not happy. She registered that clearly. Satisfaction and happiness were different registers, and she was in the former, which felt nothing like the movie suggested it should. It felt more like the moment after a long code when the patient's rhythm returned and you stripped the gloves and your hands were slightly shaking and you were not glad exactly, but you were anchored in the specific reality of having done the thing that needed doing. She drank the water. She went back to work. Vetter filed the emergency warrant application at 2:14 a.m. The federal magistrate on duty was a woman named Holt, who had the reputation, Vetter told Callie in passing, of being constitutionally immune to being rushed and constitutionally immune to being stonewalled, which meant she took her time with the filing and also declined to be moved by the phone call she received at 2:30 from a number Callie later learned traced to a legislative aide working late in a Washington office building. Magistrate Holt reviewed the filing for 40 minutes. She approved the warrants at 3:22 a.m. The arrest began at 4:05. Callie was not present for any of them. She was in Trauma Bay 2 when the federal team moved on the first address. A Vorlon Group executive named Paulson, who had been the operational director for the sector during Kashari, and she was documenting a head laceration when they moved on the second. A logistics coordinator named Webb, who had been the one to authorize the QRF reroute and had apparently spent 4 years telling himself it was a defensible call. She learned about the Dunn arrest from Rourke, who appeared in the bay doorway at 5:15 with the look of a man who had been awake for 24 hours and was going to be awake for several more and had found, somewhere in that span, a piece of information worth delivering in person. Scottsdale PD coordinated with federal agents, he said. Dunn is in custody. She finished the suture she was placing, tied it off, checked the field. Okay, she said. That's all you've got? She looked up. What else should I have? He thought about it. I don't know. Something. He's in custody. That's the right outcome. She stripped the gloves. How's the patient in Bay 1? The witness? Stable. Transferred to a secure medical facility an hour ago. Good. She moved to the documentation station. Rourke followed her to the doorway and leaned against the frame with the posture of someone who wasn't leaving yet. You're going to keep working, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Shift ends at 7. After everything that... Rourke. She looked at him. People are going to come through that door between now and 7 a.m. who don't know anything about Vorlan Group or Kashari Province or Senate Armed Services Committees. They're just going to be hurt or sick or scared, and I'm going to be the nurse who was here. She looked back at the screen. That's not a consolation prize. That's actually the thing I chose. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. He went and got 2 coffees from the break room and left one on the station without comment and went to find somewhere to sit that wasn't in the way. Senator Aldrin Brace was arrested at 5:58 a.m. Callie found out at 6:12 when Vetter walked into the hospital with the specific controlled energy of someone managing a significant thing calmly and told her. His counsel filed an emergency motion at 5 a.m. to block the warrant, Vetter said. The classification argument. Magistrate Holt had already sealed the filing docket against external challenge based on our emergency application. His counsel got a response at 5:47, informing them the motion had no standing. He paused. Federal agents executed the warrant at 5:58. He was at his Washington residence. Callie thought about that. A senator, in his residence before 6 a.m., being arrested on federal charges with the weight of 2 independent evidentiary streams and 4 years of documented procurement fraud behind the warrants. She thought about what that looked like from the outside. The cars, the agents, the specific indignity of the process that did not care about committee seats or tenure or the institutional gravity of a person who had spent decades accumulating the kind of power that made other people small. Does he know about the archive? She said. He knows. His aide tried to reach the county clerk's office at 4 a.m. The building is under federal seal. Vetter looked at her steadily. He also knows about Nadia. He knows she surfaced. He tried to pull her travel records at 4:30. And she was already in federal protective custody, so the pull hit a wall. A pause. He's going to try to attack the evidentiary chain. His lawyers will argue the Kashari documents were obtained improperly, that the classification status wasn't adequately considered, that he's going to lose, she said. Yes, he is. Well, Vetter said it without flourish. But it'll take time. That's what the law takes. Yes, he looked at her. I want to be clear about something. The case we're building now, with Nadia's documentation, the archive, the testimony, the financial trail, it's comprehensive. The people in the room when Kashari happened, the people who covered it, the people who have been running Vorlan's enforcement arm, we have enough. To charge all of them, to convict most of them. He said it carefully. I won't promise you a perfect outcome. I'll promise you a real one. She understood the distinction. She'd been in enough situations to know that the difference between real and perfect was usually the distance between what justice looked like and what it felt like, and that collapsing those 2 things was how people went wrong. That's enough, she said. He nodded. I'm going to need you in Washington, testimony. It won't happen quickly. Weeks, probably months before the formal proceedings. But your account of Kashari, the extraction, the 4 years, it's central. I'll be there. You'll need representation. I'll handle it. He looked at her once more, with the expression of someone who had added up the sum of the last 24 hours and arrived at an assessment he hadn't expected when he'd walked into Halcyon General the previous afternoon. One more thing, he said. The Admiral wants to speak with you. Not officially. He asked me to ask you. She looked at the clock. 6:22. After 7, she said. Bullshit. At 6:45, Gregor Fitch came to the nursing station. He had the look of a man who had not slept and had spent the sleepless hours receiving information that progressively worsened. His tie was gone. His collar was open. He had the specific expression of someone standing at the junction of multiple converging consequences and trying to calculate which direction led to the smallest damage. He stood at the station. She looked at him. "The federal investigators," he said, "have requested the full personnel reassignment records for this department going back 18 months. They've indicated the specific focus is the reassignment orders from yesterday morning." He stopped. "Dr. Westbrook's orders." They've also indicated that the administrative decision to clear the trauma bay of nursing staff during the VYP patient's care window is under review for potential liability. She waited. "I want you to know," he said, "that the hospital's position, my position, is that the nursing staff acted appropriately throughout yesterday's events. At every point." She looked at him steadily. "That's an interesting position to arrive at." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I should have. You prioritized the department chief's authority over the clinical record. That's documented." She said it without anger because anger would have required more energy than the moment deserved. "The Federal Review will see everything. The reassignment order, the time it was issued, what happened to the patient in the window that followed. You don't need to tell me what the hospital's position is. The records say it clearly enough." He stood there for a moment. "Is there anything I can do?" he said. There's a woman named Lorraine in Bay 4 who hasn't had a social work consult yet. She came in yesterday morning and she's been mostly alone since then. That's something you could do." He blinked. "Room 4, she said. He went. She watched him go and thought that people were complicated in ways that rarely resolved cleanly, and that Fitch was probably not a bad person in any deep structural sense, but was the specific kind of person who organized themselves around institutional authority rather than independent judgment, and that the two things looked identical until the moment they diverged, and then the divergence cost something real. It had cost something real yesterday. The Federal Review would establish the scope of it. That was how accountability worked, when it worked. At 7:03, she handed off to the morning team, gave a full verbal report on every patient, flagged the same 2 items in the abdominal case she'd flagged before, and said nothing about anything that had happened between the start of her shift and now that wasn't in the clinical record. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room. She was pulling on her jacket when Dottie appeared. Dottie had been here since before Callie's shift started. She looked like someone who had run a department through a federal incident and was still standing, which was because she had, and she was. "Admiral wants to talk to you," Dottie said. "Rourke told me. He's in the family consultation room off the main lobby." "I know. He's been waiting since 6. "I know that too." Dottie studied her. "You've been carrying this for a long time." "Yes." The 6 people. It wasn't a question. Dottie had clearly assembled something during the hours while things were happening around her. "From the military." "Yes." "And now?" "And now the people responsible for it are being arrested, and the case will take however long it takes, and I'll testify, and it'll be public, and their names will be in the record." She looked at Dottie directly. "That's not everything, but it's what the real version of this looks like." Dottie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the specific directness of a woman who had been a charge nurse for 20 years and had decided that the moment warranted it, "I've known something was different about you since you started here. Not wrong. Just layered. More than the job." She paused. "You were a good nurse before yesterday. You're still a good nurse today? I want you to know that's not a small thing to me." Callie stood with that for a moment. "Thank you, Dot." She went to the family consultation room. Admiral Marcus Dole was sitting in one of the upholstered chairs that hospitals put in these rooms because the rooms were for families receiving news, and the chairs were meant to soften it. He stood when she came in, which was the military reflex, and then seemed to remember something and sat back down, which was the human one. She sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You saved my life," he said. "Twice. Yesterday." "The counteragent saved your life. I just identified what was in the line." "That's a technical distinction." "Yes." He looked at his hands. He was not a man who looked at his hands often, she thought. The gesture cost him something. "I signed the operational authorization for Kashashri. I didn't know about the Vorlon amendment. I didn't know the QRF authority had been contracted out. I have spent 4 years believing I ran an operation that had a catastrophic extraction failure. He paused. I now know the failure wasn't operational. It was criminal. And the people who made it criminal used my authorization as the legitimate front for a structure I had no knowledge of. I know, she said. That doesn't make it better. No, it doesn't. He looked at her. I want to say something to you, and I want you to tell me if it's wrong to say it. Okay? I'm sorry. Not officially. Not on behalf of the institution, or the branch, or any structure. I am sorry as the person who set that operation in motion and who couldn't protect the people in it and who spent 4 years thinking they were gone and now knows they were failed. He paused. I'm sorry for the 6. She sat with that. She let it be what it was. Not enough, not nothing. The specific insufficient weight of an honest statement made by a human being in a room that had been designed for exactly this kind of reckoning. I hear you, she said. They sat in the quiet for a moment. What happens now? He said. For you. Testimony, federal proceedings, probably months. And after? She thought about Bay 2, the monitor, the rhythm finding its shape. I work my shifts, she said. He looked at her with something that was almost but not quite surprise. You're going to stay here? I'm a trauma nurse. This is where trauma nurses work. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I want to formally recommend the restoration of your military record. Your rank, your decorations, the citation for Kashari that was never filed. He said it carefully, as though the words needed to be placed rather than spoken. You deserve to have your real history on record. The one that actually happened. She was about to answer when Rourke opened the door. He had the look of a man who had just received information through his radio that had changed the shape of the next few hours. He looked at Callie and said, with the particular brevity of someone prioritizing information over cushioning, Vetter needs you, now. What happened? Brace's legal team filed a countermotion with the appellate duty judge at 6 a.m. before Holt could seal it. Different judge. The motion is claiming that the primary witness, you, was operating as an unregistered intelligence asset during your civilian employment, which would classify your documentation and testimony under national security statutes and make them inadmissible in a civilian court. She went still. They're not wrong about the classification angle, Rourke continued. Your military identity, your actual identity, was classified above top secret. The documentation you built here, while operating under a covert civilian identity, technically exists in a legal gray zone regarding jurisdiction. He looked at her steadily. If the appellate judge agrees to hear the motion, Vetter's case doesn't fall apart, but it gets complicated in a way that Brace's lawyers can use to delay for years. She stood. Where's Vetter? Federal Field Office, 20 minutes out. She looked at the Admiral. He was already on his feet. I'm coming, he said. She had her jacket, her bag, her badge out of habit. She was moving through the doorway when her phone buzzed. Nadia's number. She answered without stopping. I know, Nadia said. The appellate motion. I've been monitoring. Can it work? A pause. It could. Depends on the judge, but there's something Brace's legal team doesn't know. Nadia's voice had the quality of someone who had been holding a specific card for a specific moment, and had decided the moment was now. I was never classified. My identity was classified. But my documentation, the 18 months of evidence I've been building, was compiled entirely in my civilian capacity with civilian resources through public records and source testimony. I never accessed classified systems. I never operated as an intelligence asset during the documentation period. Another pause. Which means Brace's motion to classify the evidence under national security statutes doesn't reach my documentation. It only applies to yours. Callie stopped walking. Which means, she said slowly, if my testimony is challenged, my documentation stands independently. The Vorlin financial records, the shell company structure, the payment logs, the communications to Brace, all of it is civilian evidence obtained through civilian means. It's fully admissible. Nadia said it with the flat certainty of someone who had thought through the implications across a very long 18 months. He built a trap for you. He didn't know I existed. Callie stood in the hospital corridor with the morning light starting to come through the east windows and the sound of the day shift arriving around her. The routine sounds, the ordinary sounds, the sounds of a hospital that had been through something and was nevertheless opening its doors because that was what hospitals did. She thought about Brace in Washington, in the early morning, in the machinery of his legal response. She thought about him thinking he had found the edge of the case, the classified seam, the jurisdictional gray zone, the one lever that might buy time and dissolution, and the slow death of accountability that came from years of procedural delay. She thought about the fact that he had built his trap around the wrong person. "Nadia," she said. "Yes. When Vetter gets to the field office, you need to be there. In person. With everything." "I'm already on my way." Callie put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the Admiral, who had heard enough to have assembled most of it, and at Rourke, who had heard all of it, and was watching her with the expression of a man who was done underestimating the situation. "Let's go," she said. She walked through the hospital entrance into the halcyon morning, and for the first time in 4 years the weight she carried felt less like ballast and more like proof. Evidence of a thing that had been survived and documented and was now, at last, about to be answered in full. Behind her, through the glass doors, a new admission was being wheeled into Trauma Bay 2. She didn't stop. The morning team was there. They had it. The federal field office in Halcyon occupied the 4th floor of a building that had previously housed an insurance company and still smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and institutional ambition. Vetter's team had taken over the conference room, the 2 adjacent offices, and the break room, and the combined effect was a space that had been converted from ordinary to consequential overnight in the way that only federal operations managed. Not through drama, but through the accumulation of laptops and evidence bags and people who moved with purpose rather than direction. Callie arrived at 7:41 with the Admiral behind her and Rourke beside her and Nadia already at the table when they walked in, her bag open, her documents spread in front of Vetter in a pattern that told Callie she'd been talking for at least 20 minutes. Vetter looked up when they entered. "The appellate motion," he said. "Nadia told me," Callie said. "Her documentation stands independent of the classification challenge." "I know, she's been explaining that." He looked at Nadia. "If what you're telling me holds under review—" "It holds," Nadia said, not defensively, with the flat precision of someone who had spent 18 months making sure it would. Every document in that bag was obtained through civilian public records requests, source testimony provided voluntarily by individuals operating in a civilian capacity, and financial disclosures accessible under federal transparency statutes. I never touched a classified database. I never accessed a restricted system. I was a private citizen conducting research. A private citizen with significant intelligence training? Training isn't access. You can't classify what I found just because of who I used to be. She held Vetter's gaze. If that argument worked, every veteran who ever investigated anything as a civilian would be subject to evidentiary suppression. That's not the law. Vetter looked at his counsel. A compact woman named Ferreira, who had been with the office 12 years and had the expression of someone running rapid legal calculations and arriving at a number she was cautiously comfortable with. "She's right," Ferreira said. "The classification challenge applies to Reeves's military identity and the Kashari documentation, which was compiled during an active covert civilian deployment, but this evidence was independently assembled by a separate civilian party. The appellate motion doesn't reach it." "Then we file our counter-response now," Vetter said, "before the appellate judge schedules a hearing. It needs to be in by 9. Then we have 80 minutes. He looked at Ferreira. "Start." She was already typing. Callie sat down at the far end of the table and watched the room work. The Admiral took a chair near the door, which was where he'd been positioned all his life, at the edge of rooms rather than the center, commanding from the perimeter. Rourke stood. He was one of those people who thought better standing, she'd noticed. She thought about the 6 names. She thought about them the way she always thought about them, not with ceremony, not with the performed solemnity of a memorial, but with the specific practical weight of people who had deserved different outcomes and hadn't gotten them, and whose existence now depended on the accuracy of a legal document being filed in the next 80 minutes. Marcus Webb, Sione Faleolo, Daria Kreff, Paul Ormiston, Theo Sandhu, Lynn Castellano. 6 people. She said them in order, the way she always said them, because order was the thing you gave people when you couldn't give them anything else. She said them quietly enough that no one heard. Then she picked up a pen and looked at Vedder. "What do you need from me right now?" The counter-response was filed at 8:53. The appellate duty judge, not the one Brace's team had targeted, but the senior judge who reviewed the motion queue that morning, read both filings and denied Brace's motion by 10:15 on the grounds that the classification challenge did not extend to independently gathered civilian evidence and that the primary warrant basis remained sufficient without the contested Reeves testimony. Vedder got the ruling notification on his phone. He set the phone on the table. He said, "We're clear." The room exhaled. Not loudly. People in rooms like this didn't exhale loudly. But the shift was real. The specific atmospheric change that happened when a thing that had been in genuine jeopardy resolved in the direction it needed to resolve. Nadia looked at Callie across the table. Callie looked back. 4 years was a complicated thing to hold across a conference table in a former insurance office in Halcyon, Ohio. Neither of them tried to hold all of it. They just held the moment, which was sufficient. "The proceedings will take time," Vedder said. He looked at Callie specifically. "Months? Possibly longer. Brace has resources and his legal team will use everything available to delay. But the evidentiary foundation is solid, the warrant chain is intact, and we now have 3 independent testimony sources for the Kashari operation." He paused. "You'll need to testify before a federal grand jury. It'll be recorded, sealed initially, and entered into the formal proceeding when it begins." "I know how it works," she said. "I know you do." He said it without condescension. "I want you to understand that your testimony, your specific account of what happened in Kashari, the extraction window, the 19 hours, is not just relevant to the fraud charges. It's the human center of the case. It's what makes the procurement fraud legible as a crime against people rather than a crime against a budget line." She absorbed that. "When do you need me in Washington?" 3 weeks. We'll have a formal request through official channels, which means you'll need counsel." "I'll find counsel." He nodded. "One more thing." He reached into the document folder in front of him and slid a single page across the table. "I've been in contact with the Department of Defense legal office this morning. Given the circumstances, given the documentation we now have regarding the Kashari operation and the official record that was filed in its aftermath, the DoD is prepared to initiate a formal review of the deceased personnel designations issued following that operation." She looked at the page. It was a preliminary notice. The language was the careful procedural language of an institution beginning a process rather than completing one. But the process it was beginning was the formal review of 6 deaths that had been declared in a classified report that was now, as of this morning, part of a federal criminal investigation's evidentiary record. 6 names, in a government document, being reviewed. "How long?" she said. "The review itself, what, 60 to 90 days? The formal corrections to the record, if the review finds what we expect it to find, another 30 to 60 after that." He looked at her steadily. "Their records will be corrected. Their families will be notified officially. Whatever recognition is owed will be processed through the appropriate channels." She held the page. She was aware that she was not crying, and she was aware that the not crying was not the same as not feeling it, and she was also aware that the feeling was too large and too complex for any single emotional expression to accurately represent, so her face did the thing it did when something was too much to show. It went quiet, which was not the same as going empty. She set the page down. "Thank you," she said. Dr. Harlan Westbrook resigned his chairmanship of Halcyon General's Emergency Medicine Department on a Thursday, 11 days after the incident. The official statement cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other professional opportunities. The unofficial account, which Dottie relayed to Callie in the break room with the specific neutrality of someone reporting facts while declining to editorialize, was that the hospital's legal team had reviewed the administrative record, had reviewed the federal investigators' preliminary findings regarding bay access during the VYP patient's care window, and had concluded that Westbrook's position was no longer tenable given the liability exposure. He did not face criminal charges in the end. The federal investigation found no evidence that he had knowingly participated in or facilitated the attack. He had simply been a physician with a large ego who had made a bad call and created an access window that other people had exploited. The law distinguished between culpability and consequence, and Westbrook landed on the consequence side without the culpability charge. His position, his chairmanship, 11 years of departmental authority, gone. Callie, when Dottie told her, was documenting a patient chart. "Okay," she said. "That's it?" She looked up. "What else?" "I don't know." Dottie considered. "Satisfaction, vindication, something." "I did my job correctly, and the record reflects it. He made decisions that couldn't be defended, and the record reflects that too." She looked at the chart. "That's what accountability looks like. It's not satisfying the way movies make it look. It's just correct." Dottie sat down across from her. "You're a strange person, Callie Reeves. I've been told." "I don't mean it badly." Dottie paused. "I mean, you carry things the way other people don't. Most people, when they go through what you went through, they come out louder about it, angrier. You came out quieter. Loud doesn't help the next patient." "No," Dottie said, "it doesn't." She looked at her hands for a moment. Gregor Fitch, for what it's worth, arranged the social work consult for Lorraine. She's been connected to outpatient services. She has a follow-up appointment next week. Callie looked up. "He did it the same day I sent him," Dottie said. "I thought you should know." People were complicated. Fitch was complicated. The world was mostly made of complicated people making decisions under incomplete information with imperfect judgment, and sometimes those decisions caused harm, and sometimes they corrected it. And the same person could do both in the space of a single day. She knew that. She'd always known it. It didn't make the harm less real. It just made the correction possible. "Good," she said. The grand jury testimony happened on a Tuesday in Washington, in a room that was smaller than she'd expected and more ordinary. Drop ceiling, a long table, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they hadn't slept, which in her case was accurate. She testified for 4 hours. She was not a perfect witness. She stumbled twice on dates that she had to cross-reference with her own notes. She gave one answer that her counsel immediately clarified because she'd been technically precise in a way that was legally imprecise, which were different problems. She took 3 water breaks. She told the truth. All of it, in order, with the specificity it deserved. She named Webb and Faleolo and Kreft and Ormiston and Sandhu and Castellano by name, by rank, by the specific things she remembered about each of them that weren't in any official record. The way Webb had a system for repacking a trauma kit that was slightly wrong but faster. The way Castellano had kept a photograph of her daughter folded in the inside pocket of her gear. The way Sandhu would do a count of his equipment under his breath before every operation. Not from anxiety, but from habit. Because habit was the thing that kept you functional when everything else broke down. She wanted them in the record as people, not as KIA designations. When the session ended, she walked out into the Washington afternoon and sat on the steps of the building and breathed the cold air for 2 minutes without moving. Nadia was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She handed Callie a coffee, the real kind, from the place 2 blocks over that Callie hadn't known about, but Nadia apparently did, because Nadia had been living carefully in this city for months and knew where the good coffee was. "How was it?" Nadia said. "Hard, but done. But done." They walked for a while without destination, which was the right thing for the moment. Movement without objective. The physical analog of processing without forcing a conclusion. They talked about practical things. Callie's counsel. The timeline for the formal proceedings. What Nadia was planning to do now that she had surfaced, now that she was a named witness rather than a ghost. "I don't know yet," Nadia said. "I've been a ghost for 4 years. I don't remember what the non-ghost version of my life looks like." "You rebuild it," Callie said. "Slowly. You make decisions about who you are now based on who you actually are now, not who you were. It takes a while." Nadia looked at her. "Is that what you did?" "I became a trauma nurse in Ohio, so Yes, in my way. Nadia almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh, but it was close, which was probably as close as either of them were going to get today. The six, Nadia said. Their families. The DoD notification went out last week. Webb's mother is still alive. She's in her 80s in Vermont. She received official notification that her son's classified personnel record had been under review and that the determination of his service status was being formally corrected. Callie paused. I don't know what that means to her. I hope it means something. It means he wasn't abandoned, Nadia said. Yes. She looked at the street. That's what it means. The indictments were unsealed 6 weeks later. Senator Aldrin Brace on 14 counts, including procurement fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the Kashari operation and the Halcyon Hospital incident. Former Colonel Ferris Dunn on 11 counts, including falsification of military records, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. 3 Vorlan Group executives, including Paulson and Webb, on combined charges that totaled 47 counts across the organization. The logistics coordinator who had authorized the QRF reroute, 2 staffers who had processed the contract amendment, the court clerk who had attempted to file the suppression motion on Brace's behalf at 5 a.m. The unsealing made national news. Not because of the fraud. Procurement fraud, however large, occupied a specific lane in the public attention that was serious but not visceral. It made national news because of Kashari, because when the indictment documents were released and the press read through them, they found 6 names in a classified mountain valley and a 19-hour window in a combat unit that had been left behind. Not by accident, but by design, covered by a falsified report, buried under a classification level that had been maintained for 4 years by people who understood that the truth about what they'd done was more dangerous to them than any operational secret. The coverage was imperfect, as coverage always was. Some outlets got details wrong. Some found angles that emphasized the political over the human. One reporter called Callie directly. She didn't know how they got the number. And she said politely that she wasn't available for interviews and hung up. She wasn't interested in being a story. She was interested in being a nurse. She was back in Trauma Bay 2 on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after the indictments, when the young resident found her. His name was Marcus Park. First year, still in that phase of residency where competence and anxiety existed in such close proximity that they were almost indistinguishable from each other. He'd been rotating through the ER for 2 months, and she'd worked alongside him enough to know that he was good under pressure but over-communicated when he was nervous, which was a fixable problem. He came to the station between patients with the careful approach of someone about to ask a question they'd been rehearsing. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're already asking." He blinked. "Right." He steadied himself. The stories about you. What happened in this hospital? The federal case? Everything." He paused. "Is it true? All of it?" She looked at him. He was 26, maybe 27. He had the particular sincerity of someone who hadn't yet learned to protect it, which she thought was worth preserving rather than deflating. "Some of it's accurate," she said. "Some of it's the version that fits in a news summary. Those are different things." "But I was a military combat medic. I've been a trauma nurse for 3 years. Right now I'm the person who needs to check the potassium level on the patient in Bay 3. She looked at him directly. "What did you actually want to know?" He thought about it. "How do you keep doing this?" he said. "The job. After everything. How do you just come back and do the job?" It was a real question. She gave it the consideration it deserved. "Because the job is real," she said. "Everything else? The politics, the investigations, the people who decide that other people's lives are acceptable losses. It's real, but it's not immediate. The person in Bay 3 with the electrolyte imbalance is immediate. That's the difference." She paused. "I came back because the work mattered before any of the rest of it happened, and it still matters now, and the things that happened in between don't change what it is." He looked at her for a moment. "I thought you were going to say something about purpose," he said, "or resilience. Something like that." "Purpose is a word people use when they want to make something sound bigger than it is," she said. "I'm here because sick people need nurses, and I'm good at this. That's not small. You don't need a bigger frame for it." He nodded slowly. the kind of nod that meant something had landed rather than just been heard. "Bay 3, she said. He went. She stayed at the station for a moment longer than she needed to. The bay was in its ordinary morning rhythm, the sounds she knew by location and frequency, the specific acoustic texture of a department functioning as it was supposed to function. A monitor in Bay 1 cycling through its baseline read. The supply cart being restocked by a tech whose name was Javier and who always did it in alphabetical order by supply type, which was not the most efficient system but was his system, and she'd never seen him miss a restock. Dottie was at the far end of the station, reviewing the day's intake board with the expression of someone doing math that the institution would never adequately compensate her for. Outside the ambulance bay doors, an Ohio morning was doing what Ohio mornings did in November. Gray, considered, the kind of cold that didn't apologize for itself. Callie Reeves stood in it for a moment. She was not the same person she had been when she'd arrived in Halcyon 4 years ago. She was also not the person she'd been before Kashari, and she had stopped expecting to be. The person she was now had been assembled from the material available, the military training, the years of hiding, the 3 years of trauma bays, the 4 hours of testimony in a government building in Washington. And the assembly was imperfect, with visible seams, and she was not interested in pretending otherwise. The seams were part of it. You didn't survive the things she'd survived and come out smooth. You came out marked. And the marking was not damage, precisely. It was information. It was the record of what had been endured and what had been chosen and what had been worth choosing when the easier option was to disappear completely and let the truth stay buried with the 6 names she'd carried for 4 years. She had chosen not to disappear, not for the outcome. She hadn't known there would be an outcome when she'd driven to Halcyon the first time, when she'd sat in Dottie's interview and passed the nursing assessment and signed the employment papers under a name that was hers and wasn't. She'd chosen not to disappear because the alternative was a life lived entirely inside a lie, and some part of her, not the military part, not the tactical part, the human part, the part that had sat with Lorraine and Ruth and the 7-year-old with the eyebrow cut, that part had known it couldn't sustain a lie indefinitely without losing whatever made the sustaining worth the effort. You stayed real by doing real things. The trauma bay was real, the patients were real, the charts were real. 3 years of real work in a real department. That was what had kept her intact long enough for the rest of it to resolve. She thought that was worth knowing, not as a lesson, exactly, more as a fact she was willing to carry without needing to explain it. Her phone buzzed. Nadia. A single text. Dunn entered a plea this morning. Brace's legal team requested a continuance and got denied. Proceedings begin in March. She read it twice. She put the phone away. Admiral Dole had called her the previous week, not officially, just called, the way people called when they wanted to say something that didn't fit inside formal channels. He'd said that the Military Review Board had completed the preliminary assessment of the Kashari personnel records. He'd said that the corrections were being processed. He'd said that the citation for Callie's actions during the extraction, the citation that had never been filed because the extraction had been declared a failed operation and the personnel a total loss, was being written retroactively with the specific language of a thing that should have existed 4 years ago and now would. She'd said thank you. He'd said it wasn't enough, and she'd said she knew that, and he'd said he was going to keep saying it anyway, and she'd said that was his prerogative. There was a pause, and then he'd said, "You saved the case. You saved the witness. You saved me. And then you went back to work the next shift." "Yes," she'd said. "Most people would have—" "I'm not most people," she'd said. "And I'm not a story. I'm a nurse. Those things aren't contradictions." He'd been quiet for a moment. Then, "No, they're not." She had never heard that particular quiet from him before. The kind that came from a man recalibrating something fundamental, not about her, but about what he thought he'd known, about the assumption that the most significant version of a person was always the military version, the decorated version, the version that fit inside a citation. She'd let him sit in it. Then she'd said she had a shift in the morning and said goodbye. Yeah, the ambulance bay doors opened. New admission, the paramedic's voice already running the report before the gurney cleared the threshold. 43-year-old male, construction accident, blunt abdominal trauma, BP dropping, responsive but trending wrong. Callie moved. Not dramatically. Not with the cinematic purpose that news coverage and federal proceedings and formal reviews had been retroactively attaching to every version of her they could construct. She moved the way she'd moved for 3 years, the way she'd moved for the years before that in different clothes, with different stakes, with the focused, calibrated economy of someone who knew exactly what the next 8 minutes required and intended to be equal to them. Dottie was already at the bay door. Park was behind her, running his own assessment as he moved, learning to do the math while walking, which was the thing residency was actually for. The patient's eyes were open. Tracking. He was afraid in the specific way that people were afraid when they knew something was wrong inside them, but couldn't see it. That interior fear, the fear of the unseen damage. She took his hand for exactly 1 second. "You're at Halcyon General," she said. "We have you." Not "you'll be fine." She didn't say that because she didn't know it yet, and the truth was more useful than the comfort. But "we have you." That much was true. That much she could give him right now. He looked at her. His grip tightened briefly. Then the team moved, and the bay absorbed them, and the work began the way it always began. With the next breath, the next assessment, the next decision made quickly and cleanly under pressure by people who had trained for this and chose to stay in rooms where it happened. Callie Reeves stood in the middle of it. No call sign, no classified record, no weight except the immediate, necessary human weight of this moment, and the next one, and the one after that. An infinite series of moments in a trauma bay in a mid-sized Ohio city that nobody came to looking for anything significant, and that had turned out, as ordinary places sometimes did, to be exactly where something important had been waiting. The monitor found the rhythm. She called the next intervention. The team responded. Outside, the morning continued being the morning. Indifferent, ordinary, and for the first time in 4 years, entirely sufficient.